Want eggs? We'll have the bloody lot of them!
It's okay, man. Cook the man some fucking eggs.
Suit yourself, Jake! Got the fucking slave around here, Jake! No, you fucking... Fucking coward!
This scene is from the 1994 film Once Were Warriors, which was directed by Lee Hoodie and adapted from the book of the same name that had been penned by Kiwi author Alan Duff. The film is about an urban Māori family plagued by alcohol abuse, poverty, and of course, domestic violence. The scene depicted here appears roughly 26 minutes into the film's runtime, and audiences watching this for the first time may think this eruption of violence comes seemingly from out of nowhere. But anyone who grew up in poverty like me and many other urban Māori families understand just how good the director sets up the subtle foreshadowing leading up to this scene. And it's for this reason why I've decided to make this video, because when I hear people talk about this movie, and spoilers by the way, they only ever seem to talk about this scene, Gracie's assault scene, and tragically, Gracie's death. And at the same time, for the most part, people seem to either forget, decide not to touch on, or even completely miss the subtle nuances of poverty Hoodie expertly sprinkles throughout the film. Things that if you haven't seen or lived through a similar upbringing would probably go right over your head. But the director of this film included so many small but realistic details that to this day impress me with how accurate they are. And it's for this reason why I've decided to speak on some of these subtle details, and why I think Lee's film, Once Were Warriors, is a subtle masterpiece.
The stars in the heavens will...
Once Were Warriors is one of New Zealand's most iconic films, and was at the time critically praised not only locally but internationally as well, picking up many awards along its way. If you're from New Zealand, you or someone you know has definitely watched or heard of this film, so it may surprise some that it was met with a lot of opposition here in New Zealand, as explained by Lee Hoodie himself.
Māori academics at the time were fighting a battle to try and lift the image of Māori. And here we were dragging it back to the Stone Age. We were literally destroying everything that they were trying to do. All you are is reinforcing a stereotype which people will use as a club to beat us over the head with. I felt at times that they were right, and that we were being our own worst enemies, to our own people.
But any notion of doubt Lee had with the making of this film was rightfully pushed aside with the death of Craig Manuko, an 11-year-old boy who was kicked to death by his drunken father in 1993.
He was the head of the dance by breakdancing and turning in a powerhouse performance. Everyone applauded. His father comes in, grabs him by the ear, drags him home and kicks him to death. Oh my God, I get all emotional about it, even thinking about it to this day. And I thought, this is like, in essence, the story we are trying to tell here.
Lee knew that the way the film depicted Māori would be less than ideal for our overall image, an image our people had already struggled to lift, especially in the 1990s, but was ultimately necessary to hold a mirror up towards the community that things like this were happening in at the time. And so what do I mean by a subtle masterpiece? Well, I've watched a few videos discussing or reviewing this film by a range of different people, and they, a lot of the time, seem to miss the subtleties that this movie portrays. Take this YouTuber for example. For context, he's watching a scene where the film's father, Jake, is with his two friends at the pub, talking and drinking in a seemingly random, nonchalant scene.
Anyone would have thought I told her that my prick dropped off.
Bro, can they please, can we get to the plot of the movie though? Please, bro. We're 14 minutes in and it's just random scene after random scene after random scene. I understand they have to set it up to where we are following along, but how long does it take for them to set it up though? We 14 minutes in. Set the movie up. Can we start? You know what I'm saying? Damn, all these random random scenes. I don't know what the hell they talking about right here. Let me like, am I just like not paying attention enough or something? Like, what are they talking about?
He says they haven't set anything up, but if he's 14 minutes in, then that means he's definitely seen this scene.
You fucking gotta spoil everything, don't you? Fuck you!
And it's just random scene after random scene.
And just from that statement alone, I can tell he doesn't understand what's truly happening here. And I mean no hate toward him, nor am I trying to glorify being in a similar environment, but just from this statement alone, I can tell he has never experienced this life. And this is what I mean about people missing the subtleties that the director uses to lay down the impending dread of this film. The truly scary part of Once Were Warriors, in my opinion, is not the crazy, violent, and shocking scenes that this movie is known for, but instead the small and extremely accurate moments and details littered throughout. Because to people who don't quite understand and have never lived in this environment, what Hoodie is showing on screen right now may look like just a random scene of three men standing around talking about nothing. But to people who have grown up in or around this sort of environment, understand that this man, a man who thinks he's tough enough to take on multiple people as set up subtly in the very scene in which he's introduced, a man who was then confirmed to be tough just a few seconds later in this scene, and the man who did this to his wife is now getting drunk. That's what the director is portraying here. That's what he's setting up. The plot of the movie has already begun, my friend. It's just been done so subtly that people who grew up in different circumstances don't recognize what's slowly happening before their very eyes, because they're not looking for these things, whereas people who grew up similar to this can't help but notice it. I've said it before on this channel that alcohol is one of the worst things in poorer communities, not because it makes the person who consumes it a bad person, but because it makes a person worse. And there is a difference between those two, trust me. He's not the only person to think this way though, and I don't blame anyone at all for thinking that the egg scene, Gracie's assault scene, and eventually Gracie's death are the most impactful and only impactful scenes in this movie, because at the end of the day, they were very much filmed to be. But to me, there are far more impactful scenes scattered throughout the movie that seem to be less talked about when I see people discussing this film. For example, let's go to this scene. This scene shows everyone arriving to the party that the egg scene will soon happen in, and it's only 19 seconds of film. And this 19 seconds of film makes me want to meet Lee Tamahori and ask him if he grew up in a similar environment, because if he hasn't lived in these kind of circumstances, I would be absolutely shocked. Because this 19 seconds, to me, is one of the most spot-on, realistic scenes I've ever seen in a film like this. From the way the kids are looking up at the ceiling, to even something as insignificant as bottles clinking. In fact, believe it or not, but the sound of bottles clinking in this one scene is one of the reasons that I made this video, because of how masterfully the director shot this. He placed little things like this in the film to add just that much more underlying realism to support the crazy scene he's building up to here. It's why I wonder if Lee grew up in a similar way, because he seemed to have purposely made the bottle clinking noise very noticeable. And I'm almost positive he recorded the bottle noises separately to make sure you could hear it more clearly, especially when the kids can hear it from inside. It may seem like I'm going on about bottle clinking, but I'm telling you, this scene shoots me right back in time, and if you grew up in a similar way, I bet you it's almost fucking PTSD like hearing it, trust me. Also, speaking of subtleties, I figured I might as well point out a subtle blooper whilst also giving you a clue to just how many times I've watched this film. When Jake comes in with the crates of beer, the guy he hands one to goes to shake his hand and gets left hanging. Gets me every time. I just figured I'd point out something funny since I'm talking about such a fucked up film. Now just a minute or so later we get this scene. If you've seen the movie, you know it well. Cook the man some eggs, an iconic and memorable scene, and although Beth being beaten and the violence being portrayed here is nothing short of horrifying, we already know why Tamahori showed this on screen. It's not subtle. Jake is a wife beater, There's no point in diving too deep into this scene because we all know what's happening. But again, this scene is so shocking and out of left field that people viewing this for the first time seem, by what I've seen of the reactions on YouTube, to rightfully get caught up in what's happening that they miss, in my opinion, what is one of the most impactful scenes in the entire movie, and it hits me every time I see it, and that's this part.
It's okay, Paul. Shush, you'll be okay.
Of all the reviews and all the reactions I've seen, none of them seem to point out this part. Rightfully so, of course, I get why. I mean, you just saw a woman getting the shit beaten out of her. But this little scene, man, if I meet this man, I'm gonna ask him if he grew up like this because it's so spot on, it's so realistic, and it's so hard for me to watch sometimes. Not because I'm scared for the kids, but because I was those kids at one point. And I love my parents, this is them by the way. But like I've mentioned on this channel, we grew up like this. Not exactly like this, because trust me, my mum is no Beth Hickey. Let me tell you, there's times where she's more like Jake the Muss. But unfortunately, this scene is very, very realistic. And when I say realistic, I mean he nailed everything here. That I just don't see a lot of other films now like this film does. Take this scene from the award-winning short film Caged In. It's basically the same exact scene. Dad assaulting the mother, and we get the child's reaction. Respectfully though, it just falls flat in my opinion.
I'm just gonna stand around while you fool around with that rookie. You're my wife! You belong to me!
Let it go!
Go to your room and lock the door.
You think I'm stupid? You dumb whore.
Please, Jack. This has got to stop.
You should know better than to fool around behind my back.
Now I'm not saying the short film should have had the guy beat the shit out of the woman, but it's not even just that. Filming a guy beating his wife to show that he's a wife beater is easy, but it's the subtle things that Hoodie does that makes this scene feel much more realistic. And in my opinion, this short film and many other films like it seem to not understand what this is. What this sort of life is. And so to compensate, they crank everything up to 11. They go action oriented with the music. And their dialogue is super clear.
You think I'm stupid? You dumb whore.
Please, Jack. This has got to stop.
And it just looks inauthentic. And the reason it looks janky and uncanny is not because it was poorly acted like some people may jump to conclude. In fact, it was acted great. That's exactly how you would pull your arm back if you're about to give your wife the big don't argue. The problem isn't that it's poorly acted. The problem is it's unrealistic. Abrupt violence is just that. Abrupt violence. And abrupt, realistic, in-your-face violence, such as the egg scene in Once Were Warriors, is done so much better because the little subtle things are done right. The music, the sound, the fact that Jake doesn't cock his arm back in slow motion to hit Beth. Take the most comparable scene between these two, the kid's reaction. Both lots of actors are doing great. This child actor is doing absolutely nothing wrong performance-wise. Both parties look scared. But it's if we unmute these scenes that the differences become clear. Now when it comes to the short film, the little girl does her job perfectly. She's a scared little girl that's praying for something. And it's here, in my opinion, that the director has fallen short. Because if I were to walk in on this part alone, I would think she could be praying for anything. Her dog could be sick and dying for all I know, and she's just praying for it. I wouldn't even know her father is assaulting her mother until it cut to the slow-mo punch. Whereas in Once Were Warriors, we know exactly why they're crying. Because of the sounds of violence coming through their walls. You see, it's easy to look past little things like this, but jarringly noticeable when watching something that leaves these details out, and Lee Tamahori knew that. In fact, the child actor here describes the effort put into the integrity of the scene a few years after the film's recording.
At first, I didn't really know how to act emotionally, and then I can remember the director, Lee, was banging on the walls while we're all under the bed and just told us to scream, you know, cry, act vulnerable, I guess. Fake tears turned into real ones, I could probably say. But yeah, no, that was a bit heartfelt. Yeah, there's a lot of memories with that one.
And now you can see what I mean about masterful subtlety. Because filming a wife beater beating his wife is easy, but it's things like this that take skill. And so, this video was made to put a spotlight on that skill, and to take a look at some of the details that are so important when trying to tell a story like this. Once War Warriors is an unrelenting, candid, realistic look into an all-too-real subject matter that pulls no punches. It's one of my all-time favourite movies, and yet one of the hardest to watch. This movie is once in a lifetime, and yet it covers 1,000 lives, and it's a move that does the little things right. And that's why Once We're Warriors is a subtle masterpiece.
In case you want to know, it's Jake. Jake the Muss.
Has always been this way. Here is my heart.
I remember all those yesterdays, understanding your every way, and I know